Hi, welcome. I'm Robin Broder, Deputy Director of Waterkeepers Chesapeake, and welcome to our forum tonight on the future of Conowingo Dam. We have quite a few people registered for this event, so it'll take us a couple of minutes to let everybody into the virtual door. We want to ask that you keep yourself on mute and your videos off. We are recording this meeting. So during the presentation, you can put your questions in the chat and we'll address the questions at the end of the meeting, towards the end. We'll probably answer a few in the chat as well. I want to thank our sponsors tonight, Mom's Organic Market, Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds, and Conowingo Systems, which is an innovative collaboration of Restoration Systems and Northgate Environmental Management. This forum is being hosted by Waterkeepers Chesapeake, Lower Susquehanna Riverkeeper, Sassafras Riverkeeper from Shore Rivers, and Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. Before we start our discussion, we would like to show our new short film that gives an overview of the issues that will be talked about and discussed tonight. After the film, Marc Steiner will facilitate a discussion with our presenters. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them towards the end of the meeting. And the meeting is being recorded. We will also make the video that we're showing tonight available to you after tonight as well. So I'm going to give it another minute or two. I think we still got a lot of people coming in before start the video. Let's see here. All right, well, again, this meeting is being recorded. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. Oops, sorry about that.
Further south on too. I grew up on the Eastern Shore, spent a lot of time on the Chester, and growing up as well as the Sassafras. The water, means a lot because it's how we make our living. It's omnipresent. It's always there, and it's a big, I think, driver for our economy and our culture here.
Conowingo Dam has a tremendous impact on the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. The Susquehanna River provides about 50% of the fresh water for the entire bay system. The river flow and quality has been permanently altered because of the Conowingo Dam and how it impacts the waterway. So as a result, everything else in the entire Chesapeake watershed is impacted. The fish, the aquatic species, the crabs, the oysters, everything we know the Chesapeake Bay for is altered because of Conowingo Dam.
On the Eastern Shore here, everything's very interconnected and very tied to the water. Whatever comes out of the Susquehanna and through Conowingo Dam, because of the prevailing winds and tides, frequently washes up into the river. For a lot of this summer, anytime we get a lot of heavy rainfall, those gates are open for weeks at a time, and we have all sorts of debris and trash washing up on our beaches, in places where kids and families are playing. We have a lot of sediment and debris coming down the bay. That's a threat to our commercial watermen who are out there trying to make a living.
Right now the dam's reservoir, or they call Conowingo Pond, is essentially full. There's no more trapping capacity left, so whatever comes in is then flushed out. Here we are, almost 100 years later. The reservoir has never been dredged. We're at a point right now where this dam is essentially a loaded cannon pointed right to the bay.
The kind of, I think, nightmare scenario for people that, live in this area and work on the water is that you get something like Agnes where the hurricane actually sits over top of the watershed. In that situation, that can be a death sentence to a lot of the upper bay species in terms of not being able to adjust quickly enough. I think it's a game of roulette where your chances are getting greater that something catastrophic may happen. And so it's important to try to mitigate all you can.
FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and FERC's job is to license dams. And in licensing dams, they need to consider the benefits of the power generated by that dam, as well as balancing the needs and interests of the environment and the economies around those dams and the people that depend on the water.
States have the absolute right under the Clean Water Act to prescribe conditions on a dam owner in what they feel would protect water quality for the next 50 years. In this case, the state of Maryland had required Exelon to pay $172 million per year, every year for 50 years to mitigate the impacts here. Unfortunately, there was a settlement agreement between Maryland and Exelon. They're forfeiting over $8 billion over the next 50 years.
The deal is essentially a sweetheart deal, but it provides no conditions in the permit that requires Exelon to do the right thing. And it allows one of the wealthiest energy companies in the country to abdicate its responsibilities for the harm that it causes by using a public resource.
It's not fair to have the most profitable utility in the country say, not our responsibility, and make everyone else pay to clean up their mess. So what we're looking to do right now is challenge that license. We've brought a lawsuit in federal court against FERC's license, and we want that to be pulled back so that we can negotiate a better agreement with Exelon and all parties at the table this time instead of one behind closed doors. Suing on behalf of all of those who were left out of this agreement. The ordinary, everyday Marylander who's paying more on their taxes to clean up the Chesapeake Bay, for the watermen who depend on the seafood industry, and for our future generations who depend on these resources.
They are using a public resource for private profit. They have to do whatever it is that they need to do and spend whatever money that they need to spend to make sure that fish get upriver, to make sure that what's coming out of this dam is not harming water quality downstream from this dam and into the bay. And that's it.
Now, I would think if Exelon made a larger financial commitment to the cleanup efforts, caused by the dam, in terms of trapping, I think that would be not just a moral victory. I think it would alleviate a lot of fears.
As the climate changes and we keep seeing more of these severe storm events coming through, it's only going to continue to get worse from here, and we need to be properly protected because it's a major threat to the health of the rivers, the health of the bay, and the livelihoods, and our whole community over here, which really is interdependent on each other and on the health of the river. So we've been dealing with it for a long time, and it needs to be fixed.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Betsy Nicholas, Executive Director of Waterkeepers Chesapeake, and I want to introduce our great panel tonight. First, I wanted to note that we had anticipated that Congressman Jamie Raskin was going to start us off this evening, but unfortunately he is caught voting right now. There's a chance he might be able to pop in when he's off the floor, but right now he's not able to make it, and we'll miss him if he can't join us. So our moderator this evening is Marc Steiner. Many of you probably know him from his radio shows and career in journalism. We have James Pugh, who is our counsel and a senior attorney at Earthjustice. Zack Kelleher, the Sassafras Riverkeeper with Shore Rivers. Ted Evgeniadis, the Lower Susquehanna Riverkeeper. Jeff Corbin from Conowingo Systems. and Arjun Makhijani from Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. Mark, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Good to have you with us. And someone did ask in our chat earlier if this could be seen later, and it can be seen later, so people can catch what we're not able to tonight. So anyway, since Jamie can't be here tonight, and I know he really wanted to be, and is someone who understands what's happening with FERC and the madness of FERC, let's just start this. We'll start this with kind of an overview, and I'm going to turn to Betsy, Ted, and Zack first here. And so, Betsy, do your best Jamie Raskin imitation.
All right. Well, I am not a constitutional expert like him, but I will try here. Hydropower licenses go through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. FERC is rather unlike most federal agencies in that they're very independent. Everything is in-house within FERC, from their administrative review process, which we got to go through twice, to their counsel. They don't even use the Department of Justice when they're in litigation. They have their own special FERC attorneys. So this little kind of black box of FERC is making the decisions of what happens to those of us who live in this region when there's a federally licensed project like Conowingo going through. FERC doesn't have the on-the-ground knowledge and experience that we do, those of us who live here, who recreate in these waters, who depend on them. Instead, FERC is looking at information and evidence that's put into the record. The most significant evidence that was put into the record is a water quality certification that was issued by the state of Maryland back in 2018. And that water quality certification found many, many problems in terms of pollution coming out of the dam, and listed a host of different activities and conditions that Exelon, the generator from the Conowingo facility, would have to meet in order to meet state water quality standards. This included mitigating 600,000 tons of phosphorus, and nitrogen, as well as dealing with improved fish lifts, moving fish and aquatic species, and many other things. Unfortunately, that water quality certification kind of vanished in this process through a proposed settlement agreement that the state put forward. Unfortunately, FERC then accepted that settlement agreement without adding any environmental conditions. They recognized that the conditions were not going to meet water quality standards for the state of Maryland, and they didn't care. FERC just decided not their problem and left it to the rest of us to deal with this issue. And that's what we're doing here by challenging that license in court and demanding a better outcome for everyone who depends on the rivers, the streams, and the Chesapeake Bay. So that's the quick sort of big picture overview. And Ted and Zack, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what happens on the ground.
Please do.
Yeah, sure. So, as Betsy mentioned here, this problem and this issue is years in the making. The dam was originally licensed back in 1976, well, back in 1926 and then 1976, and here we are up in 2014, it was up for relicense again. And typically what happens with a relicensing is a lot of studies go into account. So, years before a dam is up for relicense, all the agencies are going to look at, what kind of studies need to be performed. In this case, when in 2014, Maryland did not have sufficient studies. And they had required an additional study, particularly looking at sediment transport throughout the lower Susquehanna River dams. And that request for that study was denied. And it was then later approved after Maryland had said that they were not going to issue a water quality certification. So, and we can get into this in more detail, but under the Clean Water Act,
for a federally permitted facility like Conowingo Dam, the state gets an opportunity to weigh in and prescribe conditions on the dam owner to protect water quality. And that's through Section 401. And they get to provide a 401 water quality certification. But kind of backtracking just a little bit, what are the most important things that we're looking at, in the issues regarding the dam? One of the most important ones is fish and migration of migratory species. Our organization has been involved since those studies first started in 2009, where my predecessor was, at the table making sure that fish migration and protocol was in place to allow fish to get upriver. Another large looming threat that we're seeing right now is the infill of Conowingo Pond and the loss of trapping capacity in the Conowingo Reservoir. So when the Chesapeake Bay pollution diet was formed in 2010, it was deemed that the reservoir would not fill in until way after 2025. Scientists then later determined a couple years later, in I believe 2014, that they said, okay, well, the dam is full, the reservoir is full. Well, what do we do? And the study that Maryland was looking for was performed, but it was very flawed. And that study was the Lower Susquehanna River Watershed Assessment. We'll get into more detail about that too, but right off the cuff, some of the flaws that go into that study, which was then used to come up with conclusions. One of the biggest ones was dredging, in that the study didn't even look at dredging and look at the feasibility of dredging the Conowingo Reservoir. And in fact, given that there was not a lot of study and thought behind it, there was inflated price tags, which again, we'll get into in a little bit, and Jeff will be able to talk about this in quite detail, is that the price tag of $250+ million that was originally thought that it was going to take is actually not true. So when we look at a filled-in reservoir, we're looking at nutrients. We're looking at nitrogen and phosphorus and the harm that sediments and those attached nutrients cause to the bay. And again, that phosphorus and nitrogen are essential for the growth of all living organisms, but excessive phosphorus will degrade water quality in the bay, in the river, and it's one of the leading causes of the Chesapeake Bay's poor health. And when nitrogen and phosphorus enters rivers, they fuel the growth of algal blooms that lead to low oxygen environments or dead zones that are harmful to fish, shellfish, and other aquatic life. So this infill of this reservoir is the most important concept to understand an issue, in that, as I said in that video, it is a loaded cannon pointed straight to the bay, because not if, but when we receive another large storm event like Hurricane Agnes or Tropical Storm Lee, a 50, 75, 100-year storm, the Chesapeake Bay will be in a lot worse shape than it was when Agnes was around. I mean, we're looking at a filled-in reservoir. When 1972, we didn't have a filled-in reservoir, so we're going to looking at even more detrimental effects to the bay. And I get stopped there. You'll have to interrupt me, because I'll just keep going. You all know.
I was about to do that. I mean, no, it's important information, and there's a lot there. And let me before we move this ahead, I want to turn to Zach. Zach, you with us?
Yes, thanks, Mark. One of the things I really just want to stress off the bat here, so we're all kind of on the same page, is just really the message here is we want accountability across the board. And I want to thank Roy for bringing up this great question. We want to hold Pennsylvania and New York accountable. Obviously, that's the source of this pollution. No one's saying that the dam is generating it. The dam is simply just the next step in accountability across the board. So, I mean, down here in the Eastern Shore, on the downstream communities, we're working day in and day out to put restoration projects in the ground to improve our local water quality. And we're implementing more and more stringent regulations to curb our pollution and our nutrient inputs and loading into the river systems. So we need to continue that trend all the way upstream to the source of the pollution in Pennsylvania and New York. And holding Exelon accountable for their role in all of this is really what this meeting and all of our efforts are about. And we're hopeful that once we can get a successful and meaningful water quality protections in place and come to a meaningful agreement with Exelon, then we can start upping the ante and moving the pressure upstream to the subsequent dams further upriver, as well as the states that are generating this. So it's really just about accountability. We all need to pitch in because of how critical this issue is to the health of Chesapeake Bay and our rivers.
So this, obviously, what you're painting a picture of here is this is a long-term struggle. The first step is dealing with Conowingo and Exelon and where we sit now in the state of Maryland, and before we can take it beyond that. Is Jim with us? No? Okay, well, Betsy, if Jim's not here yet, let me go back.
No, I'm there.
Oh, you're there. Yes, there he is. Good. Sorry, man. Didn't know you were there. All I saw was a lovely Waterkeeper symbol. I wasn't sure who was behind it, but you're behind that door. So let's talk a bit, and I know Betsy, you can pick up on some of this, but I want Jim, you to start with where we are with the litigation and process, and if you can describe why this is a national precedent. I mean, what comes out of this case?
Sure. Well, let me first start by saying that the only reason we're in litigation is that there was literally no alternative left. The people who care about the Bay and care about Susquehanna have been working for years to try to get the conditions necessary to clean up the discharges from the dam. And they were shut out of this process at every step of the way. And the last thing that happened was that FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, accepted the sweetheart deal that you heard about on the recording, and gave its blessing to a 50-year license for the dam that did not include any of the conditions that Maryland had already determined were necessary for the cleanup of the bay and the river. That much is undisputed. There is no question that the conditions that are in that license will not ever lead to compliance with water quality standards. And that is why the groups had to challenge the license. They've challenged the license in court. The court is the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. The case is on the books, it's pending. It will get briefed next year. It will probably get decided in about a year or a year and a half. And the goal of this case is simply to get this awful license thrown out so that all the people who are affected by the dam and its discharges can go back to the table and get some kind of conditions on the license that will actually lead to a cleanup of the bay and a cleanup of the river. So I think that answers the first part I hope that answers the first part of your question.
Yep.
And I guess the other piece of this is sort of the national significance. And I don't want to get too much into the substance of this litigation, but it is, I think, unprecedented for FERC or a state to claim that a water quality certification that's already been issued, and that's what happened here. For the state of Maryland issued a certification for the dam 4 years ago. I don't think anyone has ever taken the position that certification can just be wished out of existence. And that's the position that both Maryland and FERC have taken here. And if that were true, if that's correct, similar harm could happen across the country with federal projects of all kinds and in all places.
So, and Betsy, and is Arjun here as well? Do we have Arjun with us?
Arjun's here as well.
Okay, good. Just checking. Because I saw names. I want sure everybody's in a different name here. Got it. So in our virtual conversations in this day of COVID. So talk a bit about Betsy before we turn to Arjun and to Jeff, just to talk a bit about the what's behind this. I mean, how could this have happened this way? I mean, this is the politics behind this. I think for people to understand how Exelon got around this, the deals they made with the state. The 2016 report that I read this morning again talks about how there's no danger behind the dam, there's no danger in the sediment, as if something has been much ado about, nothing is being made here. So what is the politics? What is the process here that we're missing?
Well, I think some of it is price tag of several $billions. Just the nitrogen and sediment removal alone would amount to a payment in lieu of about 8.6 billion over the 50-year term. So there's a lot of money at stake, and sometimes money does not bring out the best in people. But as Jim was saying, the state did its job. They issued a water quality certification. They identified the numerous impacts. They then said that Exelon has to do a wide variety of things in order to meet state water quality standards. They had a public hearing, a public process. I was at the public hearing. Many others here were as well. And then they just sort of tried to wave a magic wand and say, oh, that never happened. We didn't do that, because they didn't try to withdraw the certification. And I think there's a reason they didn't. I think the reason that they didn't is because they would have had to go through administrative process. There would have been notice, comment, and an ability to challenge the withdrawal of that permit. So instead, what the state did is, in their deal with Exelon, they just decided to say, we're going to waive our right to issue the certification, despite having issued the certification more than 3 years ago. So I could say, for anybody who's participating in this webinar right now, you're already here. So if you right now waive your right to attend this webinar, it doesn't make you not here. And unfortunately, that's the situation we're in. And they settled for pennies on the dollar and waves away their authority for the future. And FERC let them do it.
They being the state.
They being the state of Maryland, yes. And FERC let them do it and said, not our problem. It's not our job to determine if there's going to be harm to the environment. That we, FERC, don't have to do that. FERC even permitted numerous errors to go through the process, and said, when they finally discovered them in their second order they issued, said, oh, it doesn't really matter. We would have found the same thing even if we had done the correct calculations. So this was a decision made before the information was all put together.
So let me just say to everybody who's here, and Arjun, you're here, and Corbin, you're here as well. Jeff with us? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Arjun's here.
So I want to get to Arjun and Jeff here, but I want to talk about consequences for just a minute, and whoever wants to jump in, just wave your hand so I know you want to jump in. So what would be the consequences if the case is lost? What would be the consequences if things continue as they are at Conowingo? What would it mean for the future? What would it mean for people coming behind us, for the environment, for the water? Who wants to begin with that? And then I want to turn to Arjun and Jeff, but if you just give us a sense of that. I want people to understand the severity of what we could face if what you're doing is unsuccessful.
Ted, do you want to go for that one?
Yeah, sorry, I was just responding to a comment. So what is this?
We're all multitasking here.
What does this mean for us? I mean, okay, so we have, let's start with fish. Originally, in the 401 water quality certification, Maryland prescribed that Exelon had to make sure that a certain number of fish migrated upriver, and that number was in the millions. There is nothing within this license that dictates to Exelon that they have to provide a certain number of fish. Actually, the number of fish is, I think, 100,000 fish, and that's capped. So they're capped at 100,000 fish. I don't understand that whatsoever. It makes no sense. And now we've seen some issues with invasive species and some other items where the East Fish Lift hasn't been operating, and COVID-19 and the pandemic and their response to it. So, that's issue number one, is fish migration and the future propagation and species survival over the license term and in perpetuity. The second most important thing is, again, this looming threat of a catastrophic pulse. And that catastrophic pulse is essentially years and years and years worth of sediments and nutrients that are stockpiled behind this dam that are going to be then flushed and delivered downstream. Imagine an ice cream scoop. There, they scoop out a bunch of stuff from behind the dam and then they just throw it right over. It's essentially the same thing when we get a large storm event. And the probability of us seeing a very large storm event in the next 50 years is huge. You're looking at percentage and probabilities that are going to continuously increase with climate change. And again, climate change was not even really addressed in this issue whatsoever. And like I said earlier, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when we receive another very large hurricane or storm that's going to cause absolute devastation to the Chesapeake Bay and the lower river through scour. And that scour is like I just described. Imagine that ice cream scoop, and those are two very important items to address. And again, this dam is 94 feet tall. It was built in 1928. And it fundamentally has altered the ecology of the lower Susquehanna River. And by doing so, it's created an artificial repository of stuff, of sediments and nutrients and pollutants. If that dam was not there, natural attenuation would occur. Sediment loads and nutrient loads would be delivered to the bay at normal rates versus when we have a very large storm event where, again, years and years and years of worth of stuff behind the dam will be then scoured downstream. So I think those two issues are really the top two issues that we need to look at. And what does that mean for the taxpayers of Maryland? What does that mean for the commercial fishermen and the captains that are relying on the health of the Chesapeake Bay? What's that going to do to their businesses? And what's that going to do to the overall seafood industry in itself? We're looking at billions of dollars in an industry that could be wiped out in one storm event.
So let me turn here, unless anybody else wants to jump in on this. I want to turn to Arjun and Jeff for a moment. And Arjun, can you jump in for a minute here?
Sure. So I study the energy business, and I've looked at the energy business in Maryland quite a bit in the last decade. So electric utilities generally are powerful far beyond their financial numbers. Electricity is a little under 2.5% of the GDP. But if you look at the state level landscape, and this is not just Maryland, it's everywhere. So far, I haven't studied every state, but every state that I know about, electric utilities punch far, far above their weight. And then there are special places like Maryland where they have even more influence than that. What do I mean by that? We live in an area where the electricity was deregulated. That is, until the 1990s, the large power plants, the transmission lines, the wires that bring the electrons to your house, they were all a regulated monopoly overseen by the Utility Commission. They had a guaranteed rate of return. They had to provide reliable electricity. Their rates were determined by the commission. Deregulation meant that the power plants were sold off to merchant companies, and we have we have a market in electricity. So the assets of our utilities were sold off. And in Maryland, they were allowed to be sold off, not on an arm's length transaction. And then, unlike, say, New York, where the same thing happened, deregulation, in Maryland, these deregulated companies now who own the generating assets that are free of regulation were allowed to come back and buy up our regulated distribution utilities. So the wires are still regulated because there's only one set of wires coming to your house, too costly to put two sets of wires and make people compete. So that's still regulated. But the big regulated utilities in Maryland, Baltimore Gas and Electric, Pepco, Delmarva. That's 80% of the customers in Maryland. Those utilities are owned by Exelon, which is also this unregulated. So now we have an unregulated piece owning regulated pieces. They're supposed to be arm's length, but in the long term and on an everyday basis, it does work that way. But their financial interests have to align. What do I mean by that? I mean that Exelon is the largest owner of nuclear power plants in this country. It has an interest in maximizing the sales for the longest possible time from the assets that it owns. It's the same in other states. Exelon has asked for subsidies in New Jersey and Illinois and get hundreds of millions of dollars of extra money over and above market prices. That's just one example of the clout of this company, not just in Maryland, but throughout the region. They are one of the largest corporations in the United States and one of the largest utilities. And I think owning regulated utilities, they actually have the largest number of customers that they actually supply. So they make guaranteed rates of return on the regulated side, and they make market returns on the unregulated side. And they can, trade off between these two. So that gives you an idea of why they're so powerful. They're, of course, one of the largest corporations in Maryland. And they're big fish in a small pond.
Very big fish in a very small pond. So I'm going to just a minute. I want to come back to the question of how this could happen, because looking at the chat, people are really interested in how could this even have occurred? How did this happen? Why did it happen? But before that, there was a question earlier, and I know that Ed has talked about this before in terms of dredging and what dredging means. And we have
Mark, one thing I should have said, which is obvious, but I should say it.
Okay.
Is that this sweetheart deal was not made at the FERC level. The sweetheart deal was made at the state level. That's obvious, but it should be said. FERC just allowed it to ride. But the deal was made by the state. The state let Exelon off the hook.
And that's a critical point in terms of what happens next and how this can happen to us all the time, why it does happen to us all the time. But I'm going to switch gears just ever so slightly for a moment and come back to this piece, because I think this is all fits together, is the question of dredging. Let me get to that now so we'll come back to this piece so we get all this in before we open to questions from everybody who's joined us tonight. And Jeff Corbin, you're with us today, right? You're there?
I am here.
Hey, Jeff, how you doing, man? Good.
Doing well, man. Good to see everybody.
Good.
So hopefully this doesn't throw this discussion off
but it's
the rail here, because this is a great discussion, and I'm watching all this fascinating stuff in the chat here. So I'm going to go a little bit in a different direction, talk about the feasibility of dredging. And Betsy, Mark, the whole team, thanks for letting us participate. Fantastic forum and just critical issue that needs to be discussed deeply. So thank you for doing this. So Betsy introduced me as Conowingo Systems. I probably know a lot of people on this video. I've spent 25 years working on Chesapeake Bay stuff, but for 5 years, I've been with a private company called Restoration Systems. We're an environmental mitigation company, mostly used to do wetlands and stream work, but now we do a lot of work in water quality markets in the Bay watershed and elsewhere. And we have partnered with Northgate Environmental Management to create this new entity, Conowingo Systems. If you've heard of Northgate, it's because they're the company that's doing the pilot dredge study that Maryland Environmental Services has been funding for the last year and a half, I believe. Part 1 was to characterize the sediments in the reservoir, and Part 2, which they just very recently finished, was to do a small scale 1,000 cubic yard dredging to look at beneficial uses and potential innovative reuses of sediment that's pulled from the reservoir. And that's going to be a report that I believe they're going to be releasing in early spring. So what we're trying to do through Conowingo Systems is really, quite honestly, flip this whole discussion about 180 degrees. We have not talked a lot today, but I believe in the last forum, there was some discussion about the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan. They spent 1.5 years developing this plan. That dredging was kind of put on the side. Dredging was, and we're going to talk about why it was kind of preemptively determined to be too expensive. And they came up with a plan to where upstream in Pennsylvania, they would achieve these additional 6 million pounds of nitrogen, largely through annual practices up in Pennsylvania. What we want to do is flip this around. Dredging, in our opinion, should be the option. If we spend time and we somehow come up and say it can't be done, or it's not cost effective or not feasible, then the Conowingo whip should be the fallback, and not Conowingo whip up front and dredging be the fallback. And honestly, just to be clear tonight, we're kind of agnostic as to who pays for this. We are proposing in our proposed project.
We're not.
I picked up on that, Betsy. But I just want to be clear, you know, our proposal is we will privately finance it, and then we'll get paid back on the end through water quality credits, which we'll talk a little bit about. Our project envisions an annual removal of sediment. Could be for a year, could be for 3 years, could be more than 10 years. And honestly, all disposal options right now or reuse options for that sediment are on the tables. So we're looking at upland disposal sites. We're looking at quarries for disposal. We're looking at upstream and downstream, in river and in Chesapeake habitat restoration for streamside habitat, island habitat. We're also looking at innovative reuses and beneficial uses in the water of the sediment, which I mentioned earlier that Northgate's looking at. But likely the solution will probably be part A, part B, part C. It's probably going to be a mesh of a lot of different reuses and disposal options. And I just want to be clear, when we started this process, first thing I did, and I've spent 20 years prior to this working with the Chesapeake Bay program, I went straight to the computer modelers, who many of you have worked with before. And I said, if we remove enough sediment, if we return this trapping capacity that Ted and others very eloquently described earlier, if we return that, do we need a Conowingo whip? Will we have fixed the problem? And they said, yeah, if you remove enough and you get back to a bathymetry of what they said would be about a 1995 bottom bathymetry of the Conowingo Reservoir, you would not need to implement a Conowingo plan that reduces those 6 million pounds of nitrogen up in Pennsylvania. To do that, you need to remove about 20 million cubic yards of sediment. That is a lot, but it's very doable. And I'm going to kind of put that in perspective here in a minute. So if we do that, we will return the trapping capacity. We will not need those 6 million pounds of nitrogen. We will be assigned those credits, and those credits are what will be monetized and purchased by the states. And honestly, it's been very disappointing, if flatly, if not frustrating, that the default conclusion has been that dredging is too expensive. We have done big dredging projects before. One a few years ago in Louisiana. We worked with a big international dredging company. What they told us is, you know, don't get mired in the details up front. Decide that you want to dredge. And if you build a wall of support and dredging is the option that needs to be pursued, we will back into it and we will figure out a way to make it work in a way to be cost effective. A lot of people talk about, and Ted mentioned it earlier, I'm glad he did bring it up already, this 2015 report that a lot of people refer to as the Army Corps report. It was actually the Army Corps, Maryland Department of the Environment, and a host of other state and federal agencies, but it's called the Lower Susquehanna River Watershed Assessment. And they really took a backwards approach to what our dredgers said. They went in and said, dredging is going to be really tough and really expensive, and let us spend 50 pages explaining why. So we've done exactly the opposite. And we think this can be very, very cost effective. And that report, it's need to understand, the report itself said it was a very high level, what they called a survey level screening exercise. So it was not a deep dive into dredging to figure out how to make it cost effective. It was a survey level screening to show just how expensive it was going to be. A lot has changed since that report. First of all, we didn't have a Conowingo watershed implementation plan. We didn't have dredging as an approved best management practice, which is lingo in the Chesapeake Bay program for do this and here's the amount of credit you get. We still don't, but we now have a process where we think about a year from now, dredging will be an approved BMP. And most importantly, is that Conowingo watershed implementation plan has a price tag on it now. It has an unrealistically low, and I think a lot of people would agree, an unrealistically low number of $54 million a year to implement that plan. University of Maryland put the price tag closer to 200 million. The first draft of the plan was over 300 million. And that is an annual per year expense because you're largely implementing annual practices on land upstream in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So do the math. Say it's going to cost $200 million to implement that plan every year. After 10 years, you have spent $2 billion. And if we can't divide, if we decide the dredging is the way to go and we can't come up with a way to do it for less than $2 billion, then shame on us. So in dredging, dredging in general, to kind of put this in perspective, large scale dredging happens every day in Maryland, in the Chesapeake, all over the world. Great Lakes Dredge and Dock, this company that we've worked with before, just won a contract to widen and enlarge in the entire Houston, Texas shipping channel. And they're doing that for a fraction of $2 billion. So if it can be done there, it can certainly be done elsewhere. Maryland Port Authority, just to put it in perspective, dredges about 5 million cubic yards a year. We're only proposing to dredge about 3 million. So kind of put that scope around there. So I'll leave it with this and just, we can go to Q&A and see what questions people have, but this is not too expensive. It is doable, but please don't confuse cost effective and doable with free or cheap or easy, because it is going to be a complex project and it is going to take resources over years to do it. But this dredging is a doable conclusion and a doable fix to this problem.
So let me turn back for a second to I'm trying to figure where our dredging people are. I know Ted is one, and I know Betsy, you're one, and talk a bit about it just very quickly. So I want to bring this back to how this fits into the court issue and how it fits into the future of the water in our state. So let's talk about very quickly why we have to dredge. What's in there has to get out, and why it's critical to do. Who wants to take that? Ted, Betsy?
I
Zack?
can start and then Ted can go into more detail. Just really simply, what you have is a massive amount of sediment. It's filled up to the top of the dam there. When you get a storm event, that we will, by all statistics, get several storm events like Hurricane Lee that we had in the past. But if you get a Hurricane Sandy or Ida hitting right on that dam, it's going to scoop up massive amounts of that sediment and dump it downstream. There was just an article in the Bay Journal just a couple days ago, I think Thursday or Friday last week, that talked about that we are just seeing the recovery from Hurricane Lee sediment, which was, Ted knows this one. How long ago was that, Ted?
2011, 10 years.
Yeah. And they could be a lot worse than that. That kills all of the submerged aquatic vegetation. That's the habitat for crabs, oysters, fish. You're going to get a complete dead zone there because of the lack of oxygen. So I'll stop talking, let Ted talk.
Well, I would just say, when the Army, when you look at the Army Corps, and other groups like even the state, these are supposed to be well-respected, trusted agencies. So when they publish a study, everybody's going to read that study and say, well, this is fact. In this case, the study that Jeff mentioned and I mentioned earlier, that study was the basis for coming up with conclusions. The state made conclusions, Exelon made conclusions based off that study. And when you look at the study, it was very flawed. They didn't model specific storm events. So for example, the largest storm or the largest, return storm was a 20-year storm, which was Tropical Storm Lee. The model scenarios weren't run on a 25, a 50, a 75, a 100-year storm. So there's really no evidence to support, or there was nothing there in that study that showed what would happen given a larger storm. And then the inputs that were used were also flawed in that they were using average values versus peak flow. They didn't account for the SAV growing season. They didn't perform tests for dredging. There was a lot of stuff in there that was excluded, and that was essentially incorrect. I mean, you put in good data and you get good results. In this case, there was bad data that was put into the study, and we got a flawed assessment and conclusion. So, go ahead.
So I want to get a couple things in here, and I want to bring Delegate Dana Jones into the conversation as well. Delegate, you're with us, right?
Yes. Hi, how are you all?
So, so I'm coming right to you to talk about what is going to happen on the legislative side, so we can pull these ideas together and really open it up. But one of the things before I get to you, Dan, I would very quickly want to come back to Jeff for just a second for a very quick thought, Jeff. And that when I'm watching you chat with people here on the side, and I want to make sure that people understand on this cost issue without going into too much detail, that to really get into whether the idea of having what are you taking out of there, how you ship it away, and you're talking to people about slurries. Let's be very clear about what we mean by dredging, what you do with the muck that we take out, and what happens to it, but in a pretty precise way so we can get to Dana before questions.
Sure. So basically, yeah, a couple of the questions that have come in, and these are old numbers that are out there and have been debated for a long time, is if you dredge this out, then largely dredging, it can do it a lot of ways. You can use physical excavation where you hopper dredge it, pick it up, put it in barges. What we will probably do, the most cost-effective way, is to hydraulically dredge. So you're putting down a hose with a cutter, it's sucking the sediment up with a lot of water, so it's in a slurry, and you pump that slurry to wherever that final resting place is. So maybe you pump it downstream into a containment basin and you're building an island, or maybe you pump it upstream to a quarry, but that's the way you do it, and that's the most cost-effective way to do it. If you need to start putting 20 million cubic yards of sediment in trucks or in barges or in rail cars, the cost goes up astronomically.
So Delegate, talk about what your plans are, what the plans are for how this fight comes to the state legislature and what happens there.
Well, let me start by saying thank you to everyone who's here tonight, all those working so hard to bring this critically important issue to light. And I'm really happy to be here with you. But it's, when we watch the great video that was put together, we read the information, we have this conversation, it's honestly hard to put your mind around. How did we get here, and how is it that we're so far downriver in needing to clean up such a mess? So this is one that is extremely close to my heart, but also in my neighborhood and in my district. My constituents here in Annapolis and Anne Arundel County see the effects so often. When we have major flooding at the Conowingo Dam, we pay the price down here with debris and hazardous levels into our neighborhoods, onto backyards, into our beaches that so many use, creating a danger for anyone that's out on the bay. My family once was caught out on the bay when debris started to come in, and it's completely leaving our shores dangerous for weeks. So that's why I'm really excited to work with the Waterkeepers to explore the alternatives and maybe creative legislative solutions that would have Exelon contributing to a money fund, which would help clean up the mess that we have due to some of their own negligence, rather than having that money come out of the pockets of Maryland taxpayers. So we're still working with the Waterkeepers in order to finalize our approach. So I can't get too much into the details yet, but I will say that the best thing you can do is to support the initiatives, is to stay engaged. And I would love to have so many of you come testify on the legislation and to have meetings with us. So if anyone, I'll put my information in the chat. Please stay in touch as we continue to work with the Waterkeepers Chesapeake in order to finalize this legislation.
So, so clearly there'll be a fight ahead. I mean, one of the things I just saw in the chat is something that Betsy just responded to somebody and to everyone here. That Exelon's subsidiary in Illinois was fined 2 years ago, $200 million for bribing public officials to provide them subsidies for their nuclear plants.
That's right. And I tell you what, Illinois really had their hands full. And what we found out through that was that when good people get together and hold those responsible, we really can make a difference. We saw this in many different conversations. I've actually already engaged in conversations with friends in Illinois on this, and this is doable. We can do this, but the sheer fact that Maryland taxpayers would be left not only with our water, polluted, our shores. In my neighborhood alone, it took us weeks in neighborhoods close to ours. It took weeks to clean up after they had opened up the dam in a really irresponsible way. So it's costing money, it's costing time, and it's costing the health of our bay. So I honestly believe that we can do this, but it is going to be a fight, and it's going to take all of us coming together to testify, to reach out to your other legislators. You're not in District 30A, but you care about this, reaching out to your legislators and saying, hey, listen, this is extremely important and a bad deal that was made, and we need to fix this.
So I'd like to hear all of your thoughts on this fixing before we open here to questions from everybody who's joined us tonight. And that is the issue, because one of the things, and I know, Jeff, this is not your bailiwick, but Betsy, Ted, Dana, Zack, and Arjun, it is your bailiwick. So what does it mean for who pays for this? So there's two questions here. A, how we get here, because this even began before Exelon, but how we got here. And B, who pays for this massive amount of money to clean this up so the next several generations don't have to deal with disaster inside the Chesapeake Bay and more. So, I mean, so how does that happen? I mean, and how do you, I mean, we're talking about a huge amount of money here to clean this up, no matter what you dredge or don't dredge. So who'd like to jump into that first?
I'll jump first and then hand it to maybe the Riverkeepers to give a little bit of the on the ground, as well as Delegate Dana Jones, because she feels it in her neighborhood as well. But it's a massive amount of money. Exelon can pay it like that. They simply can, but more than that, it's their responsibility. Had they maintained this dam the same way that any of us are required to maintain our cars, our lawns, our everything, our roofs, our trees from falling on neighbors, if they had done any of that over the last 95 years, we wouldn't be in nearly as bad of a situation as we are now. So that's why they're responsible here. They could have done it differently, and instead they chose to only make profit and not do any maintenance. Zack, I know you have a big debris problem down where you are.
Yeah, why don't you jump in, Zack?
Yeah, absolutely. We're on the receiving end here of everything coming through the dam here on the Eastern Shore. So that's the debris, that's the trash, that's the sediment, that's all the other pollutants that are washing down anytime there's these scour events, anytime those gates are open. And so that directly negatively impacts the livelihoods of our commercial watermen, directly negatively impacts the recreation opportunities for our residents and our visitors and our tourism industries. And it degrades water quality, as we've already discussed. And so now with Exelon kind of shirking its responsibility here, that is now a double whammy for us Marylanders here that are already dealing with this debris and these issues day in and day out and having our livelihoods threatened. And then now we're expected to be on the hook to cover for Exelon here. And so it's really just salt in the wound when we're really being punished all the time year round by what's coming down. And then when you think of all the hard work that our farmers have been doing to implement best management practices and nutrient reductions, all of the different residential practices and that homeowners are required to do in our neighborhoods and our communities, all of the work that I do as Riverkeeper and all of the other Riverkeepers do around the bay, we're contributing down here. We're pitching in and doing our fair share. And so it's time that Exelon steps up and does their fair share. Because we're doing great work here on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and we need to see that continue. We still have stuff that we can improve on, but the threat that Conowingo and the debris and sediment behind that faces is that it can quickly erase all of the progress that we've made towards these Bay TMDLs and our local county whips. And so I would hate to see all of that hard work and progress that our community members have done over the last several decades now just be erased because of corporate greed and abdication of duty.
Dana, were you raising your hand to say something?
I wasn't raising my hand, but I sure was agreeing with everything that Zack said. I can't agree with him more. And I was like, yes, keep going, Zack. Zack, I'm looking forward to you coming and testifying, buddy.
So Mark,
yes.
Mark, this is Jeff Corbin. Can I just add, and again, my issue is not who pays for it, but can't overemphasize enough, and I don't mean to throw cold water on the Conowingo watershed implementation plan. A lot of people worked tirelessly for a year on that, and there's a lot of good effort that went into it. But if you implement that plan, it does nothing to address any of the storm events that you've been talking about for 10 years. And if you look back, we're now getting 100-year storms every 2 to 3 years. We've gotten a 1,000-year storm in the last several years. There is in our near future a big storm coming that'll make everybody forget about Hurricane Agnes, because it'll be the second biggest storm. So you have to do something. If you're concerned about the scouring and what's stored up, dredging has to be at least part of the solution.
No, clearly. I mean, and you know, when I first hear about dredging, my first response is, I remember covering all this before a couple decades back, when dredging was the monster. Dredging was the environmental disaster. But now, because of what's happened behind the dam and what's happening in the Susquehanna, it may be the only way to begin to ameliorate the problem at the very least. And I saw that somebody, as you were chatting back and forth, Betsy, I saw somebody was saying, yeah, but they're just going to pass that on to ratepayer, right? If Exelon has to pay the bill, they're still going to make us pay the bill.
They're certainly going to try, but in order to raise the rates, they're going to have to get permission through the Public Service Commission. So it's not that they can just automatically raise the rates. And the fact that they brought this on themselves while making billions of dollars in profit is something that should be considered. And Arjun, I think, can add to this because he's quite the energy expert.
So, yeah, I can respond to what it means to say brought it.
As I was saying, Exelon has. Sorry.
I just wanted you to kind of respond to something Betsy just said, which was,
right.
I mean, what does it mean they brought it on themselves?
Well, what I was going to say is when Exelon owns the generating plants outside the regulatory system, they have to compete to put their electrons on the wholesale market in the PJM interconnect, which is a 13-state plus DC affair. And so Conowingo is part of the deregulated generating stations that they own. They don't automatically get to charge more for the power from Conowingo just because they spend more money to maintain it. So, I mean, that's part of the reason they might be resisting. You know, I haven't looked at the paperwork, but I'm imagining that would be, profit-oriented companies would resist extra expense that they can't recover. They can't automatically recover it from ratepayers because the Public Utility Commission only regulates the wires side. And on a daily basis, the generating side of Exelon is insulated from, it would be really transparent corruption if it were not. If they were fixing deals to buy power at higher prices from Exelon, they can't do that. And I don't think anybody has alleged that they are doing it. So they would be kind of stuck in the sense with this higher cost, and they would have to sell the electricity. Now, I haven't looked at what all the costs are and what it might mean in the marketplace, but they don't get to charge the ratepayers for Conowingo electricity. They can't sell it, they can't sell it.
I feel like sometimes this is maybe a tad digression. It almost feels like we're in the 1880s with monopolies calling the shots and saying what they will and what they will not do, whether we're talking about the digital world or the world of our energy, that it seems to be down upon us here. So the question, I'm very curious what you all see as really the next steps. What happens here? How do you, I mean, Exelon is a huge company with lots of influence, lots of power, clearly, no pun intended with power, but lots of power. So where do we go from here? How does this begin to happen? Because with all the things that we face in this state, in this country at this moment, to get people's attention, to get Exelon's attention, to say we have to begin now to do the process, whether it's Jeff and dredging and all the other things we're talking about. How do we begin? Where does it begin? Arjun, you want to start, and we'll go around the room, and then I'll open the question.
I don't know about the dam, and the Chesapeake Bay side of the equation. I know about the utility side. So the big mistake we made in Maryland is to allow merchant generating companies to own the regulated utilities. I think there's a sort of a long-term structural problem there that also gives Exelon oversized influence in Maryland. I think since we have Delegate Jones here, I think at least legislation should be considered that would require divestment, that merchant generating companies selling into the Maryland market via the wholesale PJM network should not be allowed to own distribution companies in this state, which would require Exelon to divest Pepco, BGE, and Delmarva. I think just introducing the legislation would send a message. It would be a real uphill battle to get it passed. I think, it's above my pay grade, Delegate Jones. But I think just introducing it, saying we don't like the amount of influence you have, and you're hurting the Bay. You're neglecting your environmental duties and refusing to pay for them. And the state made this sweetheart deal, the MDE did. Was it MDE, Betsy? And so the legislature can take some action to fix that problem. From the utility side, I think the clearest message would be, we don't like this consolidated ownership of distribution and merchant generation.
So, but other folks want to jump in on this final question before we get to the questions that I want people to start putting in the chat so we can hear your thoughts and ideas here.
Well, I don't think he will jump in, but our counsel over there, Jim Pugh, I think would answer the question of, well, we're suing them. And hopefully we're going to invalidate this license and start over again and get a much better agreement that actually is protective of everyone, Marylanders, Pennsylvanians, everyone in the Bay system, our economies and our environment.
And I'll just say too, there's a lot more to this situation than what we've gone over tonight. It is a very complicated situation. But, again, the dam has fundamentally altered the ecology of the river and the Bay, and that's very critical just to basically understand at a basic level. Maryland had prescribed conditions under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act on Exelon that would protect water quality. Exelon fought them in court. They settled their disputes behind closed doors with no public input. The settlement is nothing close to what Maryland originally wanted in protecting water quality and the fish species. And Maryland retroactively forfeited all of their rights under the Clean Water Act, which is really, I think it's the first time in history that this situation has ever happened in this country. And again, which was unlawful. FERC issuing the license, unlawful. So, our grassroots advocacy and legal action is to ensure that Exelon pays its fair share in addressing the harms that the dam causes to the river and to the Bay and to fish migration, et cetera.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? I mean, I'm curious, Dan, let me ask you this question since I can see you and and by the way, if you hear croaking, it's not me. We have in this little part of our study here, Pacific tree frogs that were rescued from the lumberyard that came from Oregon and Washington. So they're in their little terrariums making noise. That's what's happening behind me. My wife rescued these tree frogs from death. So they're here. Dana, so I mean, what about the political fight inside the legislature?
Well, I wish I had something as cool as your background noise. I'm going to be honest. It's just a bunch of legislators arguing with each other out in the hallway.
Are they croaking? No, okay, go ahead.
Crying and whining. No, I'm going to be honest. It is going to be an uphill battle, but when we put forth legislation and we really draw everyone's attention to, others on this call have called it a sweetheart deal. I don't think it even, I think it surpasses a sweetheart deal. It's somewhat unbelievable. And how is it that more don't know of this, don't know how this happened, there's so many unanswered questions. And I feel that when we're talking about a company the size of Exelon, where we're talking about them walking away from their duties and the environment, I think that it's time that we connect the dots, not just for folks in Maryland, for environmentalists, for people who enjoy the Bay and everything, but also our legislators. And I do believe that when we draw attention with this legislation to exactly what has transpired, we're gonna, definitely gonna have some colleagues who honestly won't believe it at first, because it is so out of this world head scratcher, right?
And they do have a huge amount of power. The question is, I can hear I'm curious what you think the arguments would be against Exelon paying their fair share.
We're going to talk about business. We're going to talk about the fact that rates would go up regardless of the fact that the Public Service Commission actually would have to approve a rate increase. There's going to, potentially be a lot of misunderstanding regarding them paying their fair share. But I would argue that if we understand what it's costing Maryland taxpayers, I think that really is the bottom line that we're concerned about. I don't care about Exelon's bottom line. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to ensure that that Maryland families, neighborhoods, and our environment is properly taken care of. And in order to do that, we're going to need Exelon to, and potentially they'll want to come to the table and work with us in a fair way. But I think that holding out hope and trying to explain that isn't the only avenue we want to take here, and that's why I'm so interested in legislation.
So let me see if there are some questions here from all the folks that are joining us here this evening. These questions will be in the chat, right? I'm just looking to see if I don't see any of the questions in the chat yet. But if you do, put them in the chat. We want to see what you'd like to answer that has not been answered, what your thoughts are about where we go from here. And
Mark.
Yeah.
Mark, this is Robin.
Hey, Robin.
I think a lot of the questions have been answered in the chat as we've been going along. I
Yes,
think
I've
for the
noticed.
last few minutes, and there's a lot of people, but we're going to try this. If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll call on you. We'll see if we can manage that.
If you use the raise your hand function, it should put you at the front of the screen so we won't have to flip through screens.
Oh, I see. There's those little emoji things. You can raise your hand by going there. Got you. All right. For all of us Luddites in the crowd, just hit that little thing on the right-hand side, that fun-looking face, and we'll get to you. Here's some questions. Let's get to them. So Jeffrey Page writes in, can we get any money from all this cash that the government just put out for transportation and all that great stuff? Is that a Dana question or is that an Arjun question?
Not for legal action. Unfortunately, that advocacy is excluded really from all government funding. And since this does involve this license, we're not going to get anything moving forward unless we pull back this license. So that legal action has to progress. But additionally, I don't think I would be comfortable with saying, okay, well, we're just going to take taxpayer money from a different pot. I think we still have the same problems there. It's still taxpayer money. It's federal taxpayer money rather than state taxpayer money.
Well, wait a minute. This is going to ask a political question before we go to the next question, which is very political. Does that mean that nothing can be done for a year and a half until this court case is done?
No, I think there's lots of things that can be done. I mean, the work that Jeff has done to analyze dredging is really helpful to know that there are options out there that haven't been considered all along. That it's much more feasible. His studies and work have shown it's much more feasible than was assumed back in the lower Susquehanna River watershed assessment. What Delegate Jones is working on is trying to get some additional funding out of Exelon to go to some habitat and species mitigation and try and, counteract some of the damage to water quality and our community. So we can do things parallel with this. We're just not going to have it resolved until the lawsuit's finished.
So just in case people aren't watching the chat, there was an interesting question there, and I think it was responded to by Ted, but let me put the floor out here so everybody can hear it, especially if folks who may be watching this later and won't be involved in the chat. The question was, what role did Brian Frosch play? And I think you answered that question, Ted.
Yeah, I mean, we've had productive conversations with the Attorney General's office. You know, it seemed as though he supported our stance. And I did want to mention this, you know, looking back before Governor Hogan was governor of the state, it was during his campaigning that he specifically stated that he was going to hold Exelon accountable for the pollution coming out of Conowingo Dam. And it was repeated for year after year after year. Well, what happened? Because Governor Hogan did not stand up for the citizens and the watermen and the people that live in Maryland. He did a disservice to everyone by letting Exelon essentially get away scot-free. It's an unfortunate situation. He did push his attorney general to, file intervention with in our appeal case, and I can let Betsy talk about that a little bit more. But again, it's unfortunate given his big talk of holding Exelon accountable.
So there's an interesting question here from Jack Templeton, and I think I would let Jeff kind of take a first stab at this one. See if and Ted, if I else want to come in, please do. But for a dredging option, can the sediment slurry be safely disposed of into quarries, old mines, without impacting groundwater? Is treatment required? Has that been assessed yet, or too early? That's a really good question.
It's
Jeff,
a great question.
Anybody else want to jump in? After that, please do.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's critical to any dredging project that might be pursued. One of the parts of the pilot project that Northgate looked into was characterizing the sediment, looking at contaminant, not just physically, but, is it sand, is it silt, is it clay, but looking at contaminant levels. And the good news is the contaminant levels all came in below any warning thresholds. That doesn't mean you can just start pumping this stuff anywhere, anywhere. There still has to be a much deeper dive on this. The only thing that came up that was pretty interesting is a lot of the sediment has quite a bit of coal residue in it, coal dust, which may not be a contaminant issue, but it may limit the amount of, reuse or innovative products that you can make out of this stuff. So first phase seems to indicate that this is going to be fairly usable sediment, but still a much deeper dive needs to be made.
So let me ask a question about that, though, to push it a little further. I mean, well, what about the nitrogen? What about the phosphorus? What about all the chemicals coming off farms and construction and highways that are in the sediment and more that they'll be dredged out and put wherever it's going to end up? I mean, that seems to me, some people would say that can certainly be dangerous. Some people would argue. So what about that?
All will have to be looked at. I mean, you're not going to get a permit from any state or federal agency to just start pumping this stuff into a hole in the ground until you look at further contaminant levels. You're going to do leachability studies to see when this gets in the groundwater, does anything leach out? In general, phosphorus stays with the sediment, so I'm not too worried about phosphorus, but nitrogen could be a leachability issue. So I'm not disregarding that at all. It's just something that will be determined at a further date.
Anybody else on the panel want to jump in on that at all?
I would just agree that with what Jeff said on that the boring samples, just, where they put a little column through the sand and look what's in there, didn't show as much contamination as people had been concerned about. But this just wasn't studied. And it's really unfortunate that there was sort of the assumption made in the lower Susquehanna River watershed assessment that there's only one way to do it, and it's the most expensive way. And so it's too expensive, so we're not going to look at it. It was just sort of a circular path. And there are a lot of other ways to look at dredging and reuse. There's a lot of acid mine drainage sites in Pennsylvania. A lot of them are too far away, but there could be some where this could be used as a product for remediation. We have a couple islands in Maryland that are sinking. Is there a potential for looking at aiding those and, bolstering up these really vulnerable areas for climate change with these sediments. So I think there's a lot that can be studied.
So George Kaplan has a question about who represented the state on this MDE, and I think he's referring to, from the flow of conversations in chat, to the sweetheart deal that was given to Exelon. So how did that happen? Is that who said yes? I think is basically the question here.
I mean, I guess it's probably Governor Hogan. It's not obvious except just for the documentation. The frustrating part from our perspective was we had been working hand in hand with the state from the beginning of the relicensing process back in 2009, and the state had taken a position of being very aggressive at protecting Maryland water quality. And they felt that was their duty. And they got scared at some point and negotiated this deal without including anyone. There were Chesapeake Bay Foundation, all of the groups right here, watermen, lots of downstream communities, upstream communities, who were all stakeholders in all of this. And we were told, nope, your opinion doesn't matter. You don't get to participate. And we asked many, many times because we knew they were having discussions. And they said no. Input not wanted.
Gotcha. Is that part of the lawsuit, Jim? Does that come up in the lawsuit? Or is that not part of this?
I'm sorry, does what come up in the lawsuit?
Well, we were just talking about in terms of how this happened, the deal between Exelon and the state.
See, I don't want to get into sort of what we're going to make, what arguments we're going to make in the lawsuit.
I understand that. That makes perfect sense. Yes. Okay. I'll leave it there.
Ultimately, I can say not really. That it was bad behavior and it neglected what should have been a public process on what happened. But ultimately, I think this will be decided on the much more clear legal issues.
I have a question here I'm going to throw to Arjun real fast, but first I want to, there's another question here from the chat. Just curious, if the reservoir is full of sediment, is there just like 10 feet of water in the middle of the reservoir and 80 feet of solid stuff? I have no idea, but one of you do. Who does know that, Chris? Who can answer that question?
I think at the dam, Jeff's going to know more than me, but I think right at the dam, I believe it is. You're right. I think it's maybe 14 feet of water that's there.
Yeah, it varies quite a bit. I'm actually not the most knowledgeable person. We can probably get more info from our folks at Northgate that did the sediment coring out there. But when you get close to the dam, it does shallow up considerably. I think it even gets a lot less than 12. I think it gets down to about 8 feet of water. And then there's pockets where it's probably still 20 or 30. But yeah, many, many years ago, it was 60 or 80. It's not anymore.
Not anymore. And as during this conversation, one of the things that I started thinking about was, and Arjun, you brought some of this stuff up, and we don't have a lot of time left here before I turn it back to Betsy to talk about what next steps can be and how people can be involved here. Is how you begin to take on part of the problem in taking this on, because you're taking on a monopoly and the power of that. And that, I think, is part of the discussion that we don't really touch on very deeply.
We're not taking on a monopoly. You see, I mean, we deregulated the generation part. Exelon owns these generating plants, Conowingo, Calvert Cliffs, and so on, nuclear plants in Illinois, about which there have been comments in the chat, one of their subsidiaries in Bribery and so on. So the part of Exelon we're talking about is the deregulated part. Their holding company owns these power plants. And so if they're doing damage to the environment, they should be held accountable for that. That doesn't belong in the ratepayer box, because the ratepayers and the Public Utilities Commission are basically on the distribution side. I mean, that's why I do think that this is not the problem of the monopolies that we used to have in the electric utility sector, yes, where generation, transmission, distribution were all regulated. This is a deregulated part, And I think that's why I suggested to Delegate Jones that one of the things that I feel and have long felt, and outside of this context, that Maryland should consider is to reverse its mistake in allowing these giant national generating companies to own regulated distribution utilities and profit from both sides, the regulated side and the deregulated side.
It's a new definition of monopoly. Dan, you want to have a quick response to that?
I'm sorry, I was having some technical issues because I was also trying to comment in the chat and leave my phone number for everyone, but it's not letting me chat with you all. I apologize. So let me start off by saying that my phone number here in the office is 410-841-3211, and I'd really like for you all to stay in touch as we continue down this path. And Arjun, you're right on many fronts. How we would tackle that in the legislature is a separate subject that we would need another 2 hours, maybe just to get through the executive summary on. So I think that we should continue this conversation.
Yeah, very difficult issue. I'd be happy to help. I'll put my email here and my phone number if you like. Also.
Arjun is the man when it comes to this, for no question about that. So Betsy, let me turn to you here, and because as you wrap this up, talk about what next steps can be. And I want to encourage folks also to continue this fight to help the Waterkeepers along and be part of that. And we'll talk in a minute about just how to contribute to that, to keep that alive and keep that going. Because without you, the struggle won't work. But Betsy, go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. There's a lot actually that we can do. I hope we haven't given you the feeling of doom and gloom and there's nothing we can do. We're fighting with everything we have to make sure it doesn't go this way. You know, we've got people from the private side, from the public official side, lawyers, scientists, everybody looking at this and trying to come up with a solution that doesn't end up either bankrupting Maryland citizens or just never getting this cleaned up. We need this resource, we need to do it. So please stay in touch with us. We have a very active blog and action alert section on Conowingo. I think we probably have more on this than any other issue we've ever worked on. We're also right now going to be preparing to file our briefs in court. If you have been harmed by this, if you're a waterman or a fisherman or live downstream and get flooding and you want to be involved, let us know. We're working on that right now. As you heard, Delegate Jones is working on a bill. So sign up for our email list. We can keep you involved in all of that and get you, involved, come and testify, send letters to the legislature. And, we've got a little election in Maryland. So maybe put this before the gubernatorial candidates and see what they say. Make this an issue that Exelon has to answer for. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to join us tonight because he's off doing important things. But there are also great people out there like Jamie Raskin who are trying to do something about FERC and the fact that FERC doesn't care what the public has to say or anything else. So they're working to reform that agency at the federal level, but I think it's going to take a long time. And the thing we could probably do with more than anything else is make a donation. We are a tiny organization fighting a big giant here. So we really need your support to keep up everything we need to do on this to protect our future. I want to thank Mark. I want to thank everyone on the panel. Really enjoyed this discussion. I almost wish we had 2 more hours to keep talking about it because there are plenty of issues, but we're going to be doing this again, I'm sure, because there are so many things that we're working on with this that we want to make sure we keep you updated, keep you involved, and no negotiations behind closed doors. We don't believe in that.
And share this event with your friends.
Yes. We will, this is recorded, and so we'll be able to send this out afterwards. So if anyone missed it and you think they'd really like to know about it, please go ahead and send it to them as well. So thank you, everyone. really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You all have a great night.
Really appreciative.
Thank you, Delegate Jones.